Well, hello plant lovers. It is Matthew in Melbourne welcoming you to my channel. Thanks for finding me in this crowded world of YouTube orchid videos. Here I try to grow cold, cool, intermediate orchids either outside or inside or not at all. So plant lovers, if this looks a little familiar to you and sounds like your conditions, do hit subscribe. I post every week on a Friday and my ramblings are very amateurish. And today, plant lovers, yes. Over the last couple of months, quite a few people have asked me about making a watering video. And I've really resisted, really, for a long time, actually, for a couple of years, because it's not that simple. And what works for me will not work for you. However, I have decided in my infinite wisdom to overcome all personal prejudice and make my version of an orchid watering video. So what we're going to go through is what I do, which means what works for me and what has not worked for me. But that is not necessarily what's going to work for you. And we'll go through that in terms of how to figure out what does work for you, hopefully throughout this video. Anyway, without further ado, let's get into my epic watering video. Well, plant lovers, and we're outside today because it is as hot as hell today. It's about 38 degrees centigrade, so just over 100 Fahrenheit in the old measurement. So it's a great day to talk about watering and to keep cool in the process. So all this reflected moisture is really great. But I think first thing to say is you cannot generalize about how to water orchids. You really can't. There is no prescribed time frame, so many variables. It really depends on so many different things. So we'll go through what it does depend on and what I do to maybe give you a sense of where you should be going with your own philosophy, I suppose, about watering your orchids. I think though, what we can generally say, and this is not an orchid, this is actually a tropical hibiscus from Kenya, which is doing very well in my climate, I must say, well, borderline. I think though, we can make a fairly good rule of thumb at the beginning of this video, which is the easiest way to kill an orchid is through watering. And generally that is through too much. So if in any doubt, just dial it right back and your plant's going to tell you pretty quickly that it's not happy, it's thirsty. Okay, so let's talk to some specifics firstly. Obviously, your climate is going to play the most important role in how you water your orchids, your climate and your conditions. Now here, let me just tip this camera. As you can see, there's my polycarbonate roof. I am outside. And as I said in my spiel, I go outside or inside. So we'll go inside later on and just look at what watering means for inside plants. Outside, I have things that are just here in summer, such as this, which is my experimental Vanda. Ladies and gentlemen, it is Vanda Pachong Blue. There you go. And I bought this as an $8.90 seedling from a hardware store in a tube about 4 years ago. And what I do is I bring it inside in winter and outside in summer. So it gets all this sort of breeze and humidity and heat and bright sun. And it's got some new leaves coming up. It's a tiny little thing, and you can see there, reasonable sized plant. So growing things outside in summer makes watering a whole lot easier. And in fact, I'll show you. Because quite simply, what I do in summer, in weather like this, is just use a hose. There is nothing subtle, nothing clever, nothing measured, nothing timed. I just do it. Now, thing is, it's particularly hot today, so I am watering with gay abandon this morning. At the beginning of the season, it's obviously a lot cooler, and the nighttime temperatures can still be a little bit iffy, can be a bit cold. So outside here, my temperatures wouldn't drop really below 2 to 3 degrees centigrade. So, high 30s, low 40s Fahrenheit. So it doesn't freeze, but it's cold. So some things stay outside. So this would go inside, and yet this Cattleya up here is going to stay outside all year. So the first thing to really understand is, well, if you're growing orchids outside and they're under cover, what's the conditions like? What are your winter minimums like? Are you growing them outside not with cover? And a lot of people in Melbourne grow orchids just under trees, so that changes the paradigm even more. Or are you somewhere where you're outside but you've got a bit of heat, a bit of protection? There are so many variables. So really understand what is your microclimate in each space. So outdoors, specifically for me, is very important. There are a lot of orchids that just will not take the winter minimums here, and that does affect how you water things. So understanding that. Obviously then your indoor microclimate is another kettle of fish. We'll go indoors later on. The other thing people ask me is, what water do you use? Tap water, plant lovers, yes. Hashtag blessed in Melbourne. That's our tap water is really great quality. So it doesn't have much added to it that's really damaging for plants. It's not limey, it's not hard. It's really great. So in terms of answering anyone's queries about whether their tap water is or isn't suitable, I probably couldn't say, because all I know is that my water is great. The way to find out if your water is or isn't is talk to local growers. The best way to do that is through a local orchid group. And there will be orchid groups or societies or clubs, really, I think probably everywhere in the world you will find groups of people talking about orchids. And if not, there are lots of online platforms. So just have a Google around your area, see if there's an orchid group, see if there's someone in your area, your state, your city, your country that is talking about how they grow orchids, and go from there. Now, the other thing that is going to determine the how and the when of your watering is, how do you grow your plants? Let me put down my trusty hose. As you know, I am a terracotta pot kind of guy, unless I am a Vanderbasket kind of guy. Now, each of those is going to affect how you water. Terracotta drains quickly, evaporates really quickly in this hot weather, which is a good thing and a bad thing. The good thing is it evaporates and keeps the roots sort of moist and the medium moist. So for example, in winter, if you didn't want to water the plant, you could water the pot and the plant will absorb some water. But we'll get to winter watering in a minute. However, in weather like this, terracotta dries out really quickly, which means I have to water more often. Now, if you were growing in plastic in my conditions, you might have to water less. So already two variabilities in my climate, depending upon the type of pot you use. The other thing, of course, is the medium. Now, this little Vanda experiment is in large bark, which is going to allow water to drain through quite quickly. The bark will absorb moisture, but not a huge amount. It's not going to be wringing wet because there's also no saucer for this. There's lots of air movement and ambient temperature. It's quite high, so it's going to evaporate quite quickly. So this will dry out quite quickly. Now, the other thing over here, this is one of my Stanhopers actually, which I've just made a video about. This one chose not to flower, but there's a lot of sphagnum moss in this, as well as bark, and that's to keep the roots moist. So this, in principle, should hopefully stay a little bit moister longer than just plain bark, because it's a denser material. There's more areas for the water to be trapped in. There's less air movement to get through to dehydrate it and dry it out. So the idea is that you use sphagnum moss with bark to retain more moisture. So these plants should be wetter if I watered them at the same time. Something in a basket is probably going to need a lot more watering in weather like this than something in a pot, which will retain moisture for just a little bit longer. Now, people grow orchids in a myriad of different mediums, in leca, in hydro systems, goodness knows what else. People grow them in water. So once again, this is just what I do for my orchids, which is largely consistent in terms of I use bark or a bark mix with sphagnum, sometimes pure sphagnum, but very rarely these days. So generally for me, it's a bark mix with a bit of sphagnum, either large bark down to medium bark with a bit of sphagnum. So that's kind of the variability of my medium, which does affect your watering. And of course, the other thing that's really going to affect your watering is seasonality. So today it is going to be, as I said, 38 degrees centigrade, 100 degrees Fahrenheit. That is hot. And a lot of these things are going to dry out. However, over here, I get much stronger sun all day in summer, and over here, less. So that side of my grow space, over there, needs more frequent watering in summer, as opposed to this section, which is much cooler. So I could get away with watering this once a day on a day like today, and this I would water twice, and sometimes if it's going to be really, really hot, I would do it 3 times. And winter, well, winter, we're going to get to that. So effectively for me out here, it's really simple. In summer, I just use the hose on everything, and I do it either once or twice a day, really depending on how hot it is. Okay, but the next question then is, what is your orchids? Let's talk about species requirements, and let's just pivot over here. So here's a good example. Over here, I've got it slightly shadier and things that need moisture all the time. So the next thing you've got to understand, your microclimate, how you're growing them, is what are you growing? Some orchids really need to be moist all the time, and some don't. They do like to dry out, and some want a really dry winter, and some don't. We'll get to that in a minute. Let's just talk about species requirements for the minute. So if we're kind of doing a bit of a broad stroke here, we've got Stanhopers and I've got Coelogenes. You can just see this one down here, and these are featured in many of my videos. This is a fabulous one. Let me tilt the camera. That one is Unchained Melody, which I featured many times because it's a stunner, very reliable flower. Now, my Coelogenes, with these sorts of Himalayan cooler climate Coelogenes, which grow outdoors all year for me, they do need to be watered all year, as does Stanhope and Gongara, which is also in this neck of the growing space for me too. So what that means is, regardless of the season, these things are going to need to be watered all the time. Now, obviously, in winter, not as much because it's not as hot, it's not as bright, and they're not going to dry out as quickly. And although something does need water all year and wants to be moist all year, if you keep it too moist, and particularly outdoors if it gets cold, it will and could start to cause rot, either from the leaves or from the roots or the pseudobulbs. So you kind of got to be careful. So these things for me, plants that require water all year, I try to water them on a warm, breezy, well, a sunny, breezy winter's day, and I use a watering can. So I'm much more specific about these so that the water isn't splashing around and going on every other thing. It's just really targeting the plants that need it in this weather. So out here, this type of group, the Stanhopers, the Coelogenes, the Gongaras, I've got a Dracula out here as well. They're the things that I want to keep moist all the time. Now, some dendrobiums want to be kept moist all year and some don't. So just out the back through there is my Dendrobium Victoria Reginae, which I featured many times. That again is a plant that wants to be watered all year. Again, in winter, I just dial it down. And in winter, I use a watering can just to moisten the medium, but I don't use a hose because in winter, I don't want to be spraying water around because it will obviously stay in the leaf axis and the junctures of leaves, particularly on dendrobiums. And that can cause rot, it can cause airborne fungus to get in, all manner of things. So I don't do the mad spraying in winter. I always use a can out here, but some of those things need watering all the time. Okay, we've turned around. Now here I have got Dendrobium hancockii, and this is a dendrobium that stays outside all year for me, but that does want a drier, cooler winter. So it's outside all year, it gets the coolness, but in terms of watering, I really don't water it. So one of the reasons why I can't use a hose, apart from wanting to avoid rot, is that something like that doesn't want to be watered. And if I'm just madly spraying, even on a brightish winter's day, the plants that don't want water are going to get it. So I'm really careful to try and isolate these sorts of dendrobiums that want to be dry so they're not getting wet. This here is another dendrobium, sort of hybrid of the sort of nobile type. Again, that wants to be drier, but can take a little bit of water in winter, hence again using a watering can, and just to keep the medium of this a little bit moist, trying to keep the leaves dry because they can rot really quickly if it's cold and wet. So out here in winter, I will probably just water with my watering can maybe once every 10 days, really depends on the weather. If it's really sort of rainy and humid, obviously I'm undercover, but there's lots of humidity in the air, then the plants are probably fine. But if it's not, if it's a bit drier and cool, then I certainly will give it a nice watering, and I will let the water run out from the bottom of the pot. But I'm very crowded here, so I need to make sure that whatever's underneath it is a plant that doesn't want to get water dripped on it, because it's just not a good thing. That can also cause rot, and you can also transfer disease. So it's a great idea to try not to have plants underneath each other. When space is limited though, as per me, that can sometimes be a challenge. We're really in the undergrowth now, plant lovers. Now, if I move this out of the way, here you can see in the larger pot, that is my Australian Cymbidium, Cymbidium canaliculatum, and it's a variety called Jessica. Now, this is a plant that can stay outdoors all year for me, but it has to have a hard, dry dormancy in winter. So it doesn't get watered from about March, which is autumn, all the way through to November. And traditionally you water it on Melbourne Cup Day, which is the first Tuesday in November, FYI, which is kind of when summer sort of starts to some degree. So having this plant outside needing a really, really hard dry dormancy, really getting water near it is going to rot it super quick, means that I have to be really careful about its placement and near other plants. So this little thing here is a bulbophyllum, and that will go inside in winter. So this plant hangs on its own in winter, which means there's nothing around it, and I can really isolate it and make sure that it doesn't get any water when I'm using a watering can on other things near it in winter. Of course, in summer when I'm hosing, no problem. This comes from the tropical north of the country, so it's loving this weather right now. But another thing to bear in mind is how you organize your orchids to make sure that things that want certain types of conditions and watering are grouped in the same spot, if that's possible. So particularly things that want a hard, dry rest in winter if they're outside, and things that want to be kept moist during winter if they're outside. Try and group them together. It will make life a whole lot easier. All right, here we are in a ferny bower. Well, not really ferny, but anyway, let's talk about other species requirements. So another thing to consider is, I guess, the inherent sort of structure of the plant. This is a Masdevallia, and as you can see, it has no pseudobulbs. So this comes from part of the world where it is constantly moist, and that might be from airborne humidity rather than moisture per se. And I've just noticed a slug crawling on this pot. Another great thing to be hand watering your plants is picking them up all the time, having a look underneath and just seeing what beasts might be there or what else might be crawling on the pots. Anyway, you can see this one flowered for me. I made a video about this. It was covered in blooms for me, a beautiful magenta flower. Anyway, a plant that has no pseudobulbs is going to need watering all the time, regardless of the season. And pretty much a drenching of the pot. And I'll show you exactly what that means in a minute. But with Masdevallias, again, I water them all year. In summer, as you just saw, it's so easy because I'm hosing everything. But in winter, I have to be a bit more specific because they're in areas where there are plants near them that don't want so much water. So it's a question of hand applying water, allowing it to run out, and really keeping the medium quite moist. So a plant without pseudobulbs will need watering all year, more when it's hot, less when it's cool in winter, but nonetheless watering all the time. And behind me here is a pleurophthalus. Look at that beast of a plant. You can see some spent flower spikes here. And this one is Restropoides dragonstone. It has lovely little sort of bell-shaped sort of ox-bloody coloured flowers. Very healthy plant. Once again, as you can see, like its Masdevallia cousins, I think, no pseudobulbs. So once again, this is a plant that really needs to be kept moist all the time. So once again, this probably gets as much water in winter as it gets in summer, just less frequency. So as I said, on a day like today, I'm watering these things maybe twice a day. In winter, it might be once every 5 days because it's so much cooler, the pots aren't evaporating so quickly, and the medium stays moist. So really, the moral of this story is, for a plant that wants to be moist all the time, test it. Test the weight of the plant. Is the pot too light? Has it really dried out? The plant will often show you too. And if that is the case, then water it. And if it's not, don't. Which gets us to that point of timetabling. I do not have a timetable. I literally look at the plants and get a sense of what they want and water them accordingly. A bit easier when it's summer and hot because basically I need to water things at least once a day, sometimes twice outside. So I guess that is a schedule of sorts. But it's not like every Tuesday I water my orchids or every third day. Really, you just got to see what's going on with them. Now, someone in the same suburb as me might have a very different outdoor situation, might be much shadier and cooler in their shade house, and they might not need to water as often as I do on sunny days like today. I've got clear polycarbonate, so the temperature really rises in here. It's kind of like a greenhouse. So I've got to keep my eye on it because things can dry very, very quickly. But even inside, I don't have a watering schedule. It's not like I do it every 5 days. Once again, you've just got to figure out what the plant needs, and we'll get to the indoor plants in a sec. So, rule of thumb is, if a plant needs to be moist all the time, say it doesn't have pseudobulbs or it's a dendrobium type that wants to be moist all the time, test the medium that you've got it in. And if it's dry to, like halfway down, probably needs water, and get a sense of how heavy the pot weighs when the medium is really wet and how heavy it weighs when it's dry. And then you'll get a sense just by lifting it up, this plant needs to be watered. And it's a good idea to pick your plants up all the time. to have a little look at them. I mean, really, I need to trim off these dead flower spikes because you can see if anything's attacking it, if it needs repotting. This has actually got a really great root system growing across the top there. Very healthy thing. Loving this. Flowers once a year. Unfortunately, it can flower when we get kind of unseasonably hot weather in sort of late autumn, early winter, and that can really kill the flowers. But anyway, so there we go. Now, a plant that does have pseudobulbs, so this is an Oncidium alliance seedling. Look at it, it's going gangbusters. This again was a $8.50 tube plant. Who knows why I decided to buy it, but obviously I did. See, it's got a new growth coming up here. Now, generally, orchids with a pseudobulb are able to store water. So they're perhaps not going to be so delicate in their response to watering, unlike our non-pseudobulb friends, which are really going to suffer quite quickly if you don't keep them moist enough. A plant with a pseudobulb has enough water and energy stored in there to keep it going for a bit. Now, the pseudobulbs on older plants will be quite wrinkly, and on newer bulbs, they'll be quite smooth because they're full of beautiful energy. It's like us, really. The older we get, the more wrinkly we are because there's less moisture retained in our skin. So something like this, once again, I would allow kind of pseudobulby orchid to dry out reasonably between each watering. And again, there's no prescribed time frame for that. Depends on how you've potted it, what you potted it in, and what your ambient temperature's like, and also the relative humidity of where you are. If you're in a very humid environment, orchids can absorb that moisture, whereas I think our humidity is sort of moderate, but not super high and not super low either. So it's reasonably good, but high humidity will affect the plant, as will low humidity. Also, the plants can absorb moisture through the pots, as we said. With a plant like this, I would just allow it to dry out reasonably well and then drench it so the water is running out through the base. And we'll get to that and show you exactly what that means later on. And it is slightly different in winter for me and slightly different in summer. So I'll explain why. But orchids with the pseudobulb, if you miss it or get it slightly wrong, don't worry. The plant will recover. It does have enough to store in there. But again, with these plants, I'm watering these mostly every day in this type of weather. They're in a slightly shadier spot, so they don't get quite as dry as the ones hanging up over there. And then in winter, it's really maybe every 7 to 10 days. It really depends on what the pot's like. And each one is going to be different. The bigger the pot, the more medium, the slower it will dry out. The smaller the pot, the faster it's going to dry out. So that will affect how often you'll need to water something as well. And seedlings, yeah, a bit of a different kettle of fish too, because they can just need slightly different care than their grown-up friends. Obviously, they might need to just be kept moister longer. Anyway, once again, this is outside all year for me. What you don't want to do is to get it really wet on a night where it's going to be very cold. So I'll show you what my wintering water looks like later on. But nonetheless, these plants do get watered during the winter, just with much less frequency. Now, we spoke about dendrobiums before. This is Dendrobium moniliforme, and it's the variegated form. As you can see, one last flower on it, very pretty, and very pretty fragrance, I must say. Ah, delicious. So this sort of dendrobium really generally do want to have a dry rest at some point. So you have to research the species requirements. Now, there are several ways to do that. First thing is, if you have a species plant, you can go to orchidspecies.com and just have a read about where it comes from and what its seasonal climatic conditions are. And it will tell you basically how often the orchid gets naturally watered. Obviously, pot culture is different and plants don't survive as well in pots as they do in the wild if you stuck to that same watering system. So you've got to try and figure out what it means for you. But a lot of these dendrobiums will come from a part of the world where it's seasonally dry for a period of time, a month or so, who knows. Have a look at orchidspecies.com and it will tell you exactly when. Sometimes it's autumn, sometimes it's winter, sometimes it's spring, just before the new growths emerge, whatever it is. Find out what your orchid actually wants and then follow through. So moniliforme does want a drier winter. Doesn't mean to say I never water it, but it means I use a small watering can and just moisten very gently the top, if at all. Now with a plant like this, which has got these sort of long canes, which are still pseudobulbs, they're still storing lots of water, they're quite fat, they will get quite desiccated and wrinkly and shrunken if it is too dry. And that's when you might just put a little bit of water on the top in winter to keep it going. Look at that, it's gone gangbusters. This flowers from its old canes, and I have only a few old canes because it's suddenly put on a huge amount of growth. So I'm hoping next year to have better flowers from this. But isn't it a pretty thing? Anyway, orchidspecies.com. That's where you go to find out if you've got a species orchid, and that means this is as the orchid grows in the wild. Now, if you have got a hybrid or a hybrid or a form or a cross, look at this beauty. This is this is me just experimenting again, like my pandas. Look at that. This is one of those warmer climate dendrobiums. I haven't really done the research on this yet. It's simply called Dendrobium dragon, and I've got to do some research on it. But its ancestry will be quite clear, and it's certainly a warmer grower. Now, to find out what your hybrid orchid might want, go to orchidroots.com. Put in the name of the hybrid, and you'll see there, ultimately, in a who do you think you are kind of moment, what are the species ancestors? You can have a look at those. Maybe there's 2 or 3, sometimes there's a lot, but you can kind of get a sense of what that orchid might want from what its species ancestors had. So particularly if it has a dry rest in winter, or it's a type of orchid that wants to be kept moist all the time. So it's very important, really before anything else, to figure out, to learn what is the orchid that you're growing and how does it normally respond to watering in the wild. And if it's a hybrid, figure out what the species ancestors are and make an educated guess from there. And again, if in any doubt, ask someone who's growing orchids near you. Join an orchid club, get on a chat page and just find out what other people do with that orchid in your climate. And that will help you make your own decision. Now, not everything with the pseudobulb, though, can take a little dryness. This is a lovely little promenade, the flowers are just going over. But look, isn't it pretty? Has the most beautiful golden flowers. I've made a few videos about this. This one is a form. No, it's a hybrid, actually, a hybrid between 2 species. Isn't it stunning? Fabulous glaucous leaves too, really lovely. So this kind of looks like it would be an oncidium type. So can you see all those pseudobulbs in there? So although it has a pseudobulb, which means it can retain moisture and nutrition, this is not a plant that wants to dry out. So it's an epiphyte in the wild, so it's sitting on a mossy branch or something like that, or orchids that are lithophytic often are growing in similar conditions, so in little nooks of moss and leaf detritus in the crevices of rocks. So water runs past, it evaporates really quickly, the plant takes up what it wants, it dries, rinse and repeat. However, there are epiphytes in dry conditions and epiphytes in moist conditions. So an epiphyte in a dry condition is used to that seasonal dryness. A lot of Australian orchids can really take periods of dry, even though they're epiphytes. And some, like this, which come from higher, cooler sort of cloud forest conditions, are constantly surrounded by humidity and cloud cover and or rain. So they are constantly getting moisture either to the leaves or directly to the roots. So not everything with the pseudobulb can and wants to dry out completely. But once again, know the orchid that you're growing, know where it comes from, and try and replicate that in how often you decide to water it. All right, let's look at specific techniques. Now, this is that seedling, well, nearly growing up Oncidium type that I was just showing you before. So in winter, what I would do with this is, with a watering can, literally just gently moisten the top, just like that. Not a lot. It's not really running out. You're just kind of moistening the top because you don't want the roots to be really wet and cold. This plant is outside all time. So that's probably as much water as I would give this plant in winter. Just a little drip like that. Now in summer I have plants on a table here, which I'll just show you, which means I can't hose them because they're on a timber table. It's actually an 18th century Chinese one. When we move, it will be in a better position anyway. So I do have to be a bit careful, which means these orchids I have to water by hand all the time. So what I try and do at least once a week is give them a really good drenching. And what that means is you literally pour the water on and just keep pouring and pouring and pouring and pouring and pouring and pouring until it is pouring out the bottom, and I have a bucket beneath me. So the idea is to really drench the medium. And if you've got it in bark, you really want to try and drench that bark so that every bit of it has taken up as much moisture as you can. And if it's really hot, do it again. On a day like today, 38 degrees, 100 degrees Fahrenheit, it won't matter, it really won't. The more you water it, the happier the plant will be. Now, If I'm using a liquid fertilizer, I do the same thing. So I really try and drench it, and I capture the flow off in a bucket underneath, and I just throw that on things, on other plants, not orchids, that are growing nearby. I've got lots of fuchsias and things like that. So I just throw that kind of runoff fertilizer onto them. But then the other thing I do with these orchids that are on this table that I can't use a hose is, in really hot weather, usually about once a fortnight, I give the leaves a good spray like that and drench the whole plant. And on a day like today, it's going to evaporate off those leaves within minutes because it's so warm. And you do that in the morning or sort of midday-ish. The heat of the day here is going to be about 4 to 5 p.m. It'd be its hottest. So really any time up until kind of early afternoon, you could do that. And you'll be quite assured that the plants will be dry, or the leaves will be dry before nightfall. Because even in summer, if the leaves are really wet and there's moisture in the juncture of the leaves, you can still attract airborne fungal diseases. So you still kind of don't want them to be dripping wet in the junctures of the leaves there at night. And I also do this, I try and do it about twice a year for my indoor orchids. So I take them all out one by one and I hose them all down to clean off the leaves and just, perk it up a bit. If I'm not able to do that, I'll just do it in the shower and use the shower head to do the same thing. And then I would water this plant again when it felt really light, or I could see that the medium was really had dried out, or even that the plant was looking a little bit worse for wear. That's when I would know to water it again. This type of orchid you can allow to dry out reasonably between each watering. So again, don't get too fixated on how often. Just get used to how heavy the pot is when it's wet and how heavy it is when it's dry, and make your own decision. So the other spot for me is Cymbidiums. Now, all my Cymbidiums are out here. So it's kind of half undercover, half not. There's this carport roof, which is giving them sort of half cover. There's this row of silver birches here, which gives them dappled light, bit of protection. If the rain is blowing in this particular direction, they are going to get wet. And if it's not, they won't. So in summer, once again, I just use the hose and I give them a really good drench at least once, sometimes twice a day. On a day like today, I will do it twice. Now in winter though, I am much more careful. So this area becomes a little darker, it's a little moister in here, kind of easy for things to rot because it's darker. There is airflow, you can see the wind's blowing through, but nonetheless it's quite protected down there. So what you don't want is the roots to be really wet and cold in winter. However, Cymbidiums do want to be watered all year. So what I tend to do, I still use the hose in winter, but I just don't do it that often. And I try to do it on a day where it's quite sunny and a little bit breezy. And I do it in the morning so that the plants have as best a chance as possible to dry out from a leaf perspective, so there isn't any water nestling in the leaf junctions. Because what I have done is I have rotted Cymbidiums in winter by just having those junctions too wet. Rot will set in from the pseudobulb or sometimes from the roots or both, and your plant is done and dusted. But this is another great advantage of having all one type together, because they all take the same type of watering. And here I've got both hybrid Cymbidiums and species Cymbidiums. Now they're all cooler climate ones, so they all want the same conditions, which is great. My canaliculatum, the Australian Cymbidium, is out the back, and that gets very specific conditions because it doesn't want to get wet at all in winter. So this type of watering would just kill it dead. But these all take the same conditions, and generally they do really well. Yes, inside, different kettle of fish, but the same kind of criteria still apply. So firstly, understand your microclimate. Now down here, we're at the foot of the stairs. North facing in the southern hemisphere means it gets more light. It's cooler and shadier in summer than upstairs, which is warmer and brighter. However, in winter, this is brighter, but still cooler. Again, just something to bear in mind when you have indoor orchids. So an orchid that is described as a warm grower for me, I will be putting upstairs, but something like Phalaenopsis, which is a cool grower, I will put down here because they don't like the outside winter minimums. So once again, understanding the microclimates in your interior space is very important. And of course, if you've got heating and if you've got air conditioning, that's going to affect things dramatically in terms of the airborne humidity and how fast the pot's going to dry out. So it really depends too on your house environment. Now, we are blessed, cursed with kind of no air conditioning. There's an old 90s evaporative system upstairs. It's still quite warm though. and no heating. So there is one gas fire in the living room. Can you believe it? Melbourne gets cold in winter, let me tell you. And then the odd electrical heater dotted about. So it doesn't also get too warm and dry in winter. So I must say at the moment, it's kind of perfect interior environment for growing orchids. So watering, what does that mean? So you've gone through those same key categories. You've also understood what plants you're growing and what they want in the wild. Do they want constant moisture? Do they want a little bit of a dry period? Anything in between? So I tend to, obviously I've got to water differently here. Now this is a lovely Oncidium type that is about to burst into bloom, and it doesn't have a tag anymore. Oh, I have a feeling it's a really fabulous flower. Anyway, it did get really badly attacked by aphids, which hasn't happened to me before, but hey ho. So obviously when I'm watering inside, it's very different. I can't use the hose because we're inside, so I have to use a watering can. My same little trusty watering can. If I were to water this in winter, once again, literally just a little bit like that, just to moisten the surface and really see how it goes. Massive pseudobulbs on this one. It doesn't need to be wringing wet, and in winter, really dry it out reasonably well between each watering, because it will not like, even inside, being coldish and wet as well. And again, avoiding getting water into the leaf junctions here, particularly winter, because even inside that can cause fungal diseases to get a foothold. And that has happened to me a lot of rot from new growth, because I've just been too sploshy with water at the wrong time of day. So in winter, just a little bit, and once again, get a sense of how heavy the pot is wet, how heavy it is dry, and make your decision accordingly. But an orchid like this can be allowed to dry out relatively totally before you re-water it. Now, in weather like this, when it's quite hot, I'll be watering this maybe every 3-ish days, and then at least once a fortnight, I want to give it a really good drenching, and I'll show you what that looks like. So basically, it's the same idea as outside. You just want to really keep pouring the water onto the orchid. Pour, 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 pour. See, you can't hear anything coming out yet. And now it's just starting to run out of the bottom. I've got a bucket below it, and I just keep doing that until I have really, really drenched the plant and allow it to finish trickling out before you put it back in the saucer. Because again, what you don't want is to be sitting it in a saucer of water, particularly in winter. I mean, you can in summer, it'll evaporate really quickly, but not in winter. So that type of flushing technique is really good to just clear out the medium as well. Depends what fertilizers you've used. If you've used something that can be soluble, for example, the salts in the crystals can build up. So it's a good idea just to flush it out, really. I mean, if this plant was in the wild, remember it's an epiphyte, it's going to be constantly flushed because it's on that mossy nook of a tree or the crevice of a rock. Water's going to be running through it, constantly, I guess, cleaning the root system with beautiful, natural, filtered mountain water. So here we kind of need to affect the same principle. So every now and then, good idea just to give it a really good flush out. And that's also how I fertilize in summer. When I'm giving things a really great liquid fertilizer, I get a big can and I really allow it to flush right out so that all of this medium is absorbing as much of that nutrient as possible to give the roots chance to get at it. However, I do fertilize more often in summer. So if I am not doing the big drench, I will just put a little bit of liquid fertilizer in a watering can and just do that topical application as before. So not drenching it so much, and you might just get a little bit of residue in the saucer, but not too much. Then the other thing I do with all these indoor orchids, as I said, is I try and do it twice a year, but sometimes it's only once. I take them all outside and hose them down on a day like today. I put them in a shady spot, hose them down in the morning. They evaporate and dry out really quickly. I bring them in. Just keeps the leaves nice and clean, flushes out the medium. But you can do the same thing in a shower. Just make sure that the plant, it's a warm day and that the plant's going to evaporate so no water is being left in the junction at night time, even in summer. Okay, we're on the landing now for the last piece of inside watering. So here is one of my Cymbidium type of orchids. Look at that. If this doesn't flower for me this year, there is no justice in the world, I'm telling you. I have tried to make that pseudobulb as fat as possible in this period, which leads us, again, we've mentioned this before, really understanding the type of orchid that you've got and what it wants. This type of orchid that puts on a huge amount of growth in the growing season. needs to be kept moist all the time. So I would water this every day to keep the medium actually wet to the touch and a little bit of residue in the saucer. Really important, but not every orchid wants that. So you've really got to understand what your orchid is and what it wants. But this type for me just need constant moisture. This is a north facing window, which means it gets light all the time. Here in the southern hemisphere, it would be a south facing window. In the northern hemisphere, so it's really dry. So even on a coolish day, because of the effect of the glass, these plants dry out really quickly. So they're all in a row, they're all together, which makes it much easier. So every morning on my way to work, I just give them a little dollop of water, enough so there's a little bit standing in the saucer, which I'm going to do right now. So there we are, plant lovers. There is my orchid watering video, which kind of isn't, because really I can't tell you how to water your orchids, unfortunately. There are some common rules of thumb. You're more likely to kill it by overwatering than not. A cold, wet orchid is more likely to die. Other than that, though, you've got to figure out what your local conditions are like, how you're growing them, in what medium, in what container, and what species type it is, as to how often you should be watering or not. There are so many variables. So what I would suggest is knowledge yourself up, research really thoroughly about your plants in terms of where they come from, what their ideal conditions are, and try and replicate that. The other thing I would say is just get used to holding your plants when it's very wet and when it's very dry, and just getting an understanding of the difference of weight, which will give you a good sense of when it should be watered, because ultimately it needs to be watered when it's dry, when it wants to, unless it is a plant that wants a winter dormancy. Now, I've made a video about winter dormancy because there is winter dormancy and winter dormancy and winter dormancy. So some things want no water, some things a little, some things you can spray the pot. Anyway, some things just want less for a month. Anyway, that's quite complicated. So you've got to know your orchids and know your local conditions, your humidity, your heat, if you're air conditioned, if you're not. If like me, you're undercover and it gets really hot and dry. If you have cold winters, if you don't, if you've got a greenhouse. I mean, there are just so many variables. So this has really just been about what I do. And I must confess, I'm pretty gung-ho, as you saw. I'm just sploshing about. Not saying that's the best thing to do either, because you can get drips, all sorts of different things can happen. You can transfer water to other plants. But you know, I don't have the time really to be that finicky about each plant because I've got a lot. So live and let live. They've got to survive or not is my philosophy about growing orchids. I'm kind of, the soft touch kind of guy when it comes to orchid growing. I hope this has been a benefit. It might not be, but ultimately there is no hard and fast rule. You've just got to figure it out for yourself. If in doubt, find yourself a local orchid club, ask the members there what they're growing and how they manage their watering. And if you're new to growing orchids, I would just say always err on the side of less is better, because you'll kill it by overwatering it much more likely than you are to kill it by not watering it enough. That will be my golden rule. Anyway, plant lovers, thank you very much for watching. If you want to know what we're doing next week, you'll have to hit subscribe, because who knows what an orchid adventures will be on. But anyway, I hope wherever you are, your orchids are well hydrated, and I look forward to seeing you next week.